essential nature of music. Does music by its very nature have to be dramatic or descriptive, or does it have to be pure and absolute? Today, we're going to answer all of those questions in the context of the War of the Romantics. And in the process, I hope to give you some insights which will help you understand the essential nature of music in 19th century Germany. Welcome to the Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. The first thing that we want to understand about the War of the Romantics, as it's been called by music historians, is that it was really a battle over the legacy of Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven had died in 1827, and he left behind a legacy of many works in all genres, chamber music, orchestral music, but it was particularly his legacy of 9 symphonies, which loomed very large and cast a very long and intimidating shadow across the 19th century, indeed a shadow which stretched well into the 20th century. And Beethoven's heirs, his followers and successors, debated amongst themselves what was the essential nature of his symphonic music and what direction should music take in future decades and future generations. If we look at Beethoven's symphonic output, we see 9 symphonies, of which the first 8 symphonies are purely instrumental. And as such, they take as their starting point the late 18th century symphony as developed by Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But Beethoven's early symphonies, his first 8 symphonies, also stretch the boundaries of the genre with respect to their length, their complexity, and their expressive content. But it's particularly Beethoven's last symphony, the 9th, which has proved to be very difficult and very controversial. In the finale, the 4th and final movement of his 9th symphony, Beethoven famously introduced the text of Friedrich Schiller's poem An die Freude, sung by soloists and a chorus. And this was perceived at the time as a kind of stylistic or generic transgression, because after all, a symphony is supposed to be a piece of music for just instruments, wind instruments, string instruments. The idea of bringing voices, solo voices, choral voices into a symphony must at the time have seemed somewhat stylistically transgressive. And I'd like to offer a bit of an analogy here. In the theater or in the cinema, we often hear of an actor breaking the fourth wall, where the actor directly addresses the audience or directly addresses the camera. And that's seen as in some ways trespassing on the essentially self-contained nature of the stage or the screen experience. Well, likewise, bringing voices into a symphony, into what until then had been a purely orchestral form of music, was seen as a kind of a trespassing of the self-contained nature of instrumental music. This is a very important point. And I made this point some months ago in an earlier appearance that I did with Mark and Rucka, where we talked about the nature of Romanticism. And I mentioned that one of the essential features of Romanticism in music was the emancipation of instrumental music from vocal music and from text. The development of an autonomous instrumental music in the works of Haydn, the works of Mozart, and in the early works of Beethoven was a very important step towards the idea of Romanticism in music. But now in his 9th symphony, Beethoven seemed to have turned that all upside down by introducing a poetic text and introducing voices. And so composers who came after Beethoven treated this in a number of different ways. There were some composers, like for example, the Frenchman Hector Berlioz, who in some ways stands apart from the debate that we're about to discuss. But Berlioz enthusiastically embraced this idea of mixing genres, of mixing instrumental and vocal, symphonic with non-symphonic. In fact, one of Berlioz's most notable works is his symphony inspired by Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where instruments and voices and text and non-text all work together side by side. But the leading German symphonists who followed in Beethoven's footsteps, and by that I mean primarily Felix Mendelssohn and Robert Schumann, who were composing symphonies and concertos in the 1830s and 1840s, they took as their starting point the first 8 symphonies of Beethoven, purely instrumental works, no text and no voices. I'd like to try to tell the story of the War of the Romantics in something approaching a chronological sequence. So, first of all, the starting point in terms of actual creative works, we have the symphonies of Mendelssohn and the symphonies of Schumann, which almost seem to exist as if Beethoven's Ninth had never appeared on the musical landscape. And so these composers were seen as embodying a kind of a trend that was perceived as conservative or reactionary in mid-19th century German music. And this was presented in a concrete form in the year 1843. In that year, Mendelssohn founded a conservatory of music in the German town of Leipzig. And the Leipzig Conservatory, which in more recent generations has come to be known as the Mendelssohn Academy, named after its founder, was seen as a bastion and citadel of traditional musical values. Mendelssohn himself was on the faculty of the Leipzig Conservatory. So was his colleague and friend Robert Schumann, and quite a few other notable figures. Many prominent later composers had their earliest training at the Leipzig Conservatory, including the Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg and the English composer Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan. There was an actual perception in the mid-19th century of Leipzig as a kind of a training ground or breeding ground of traditionalism or conservatism in musical circles. And that's best illustrated by a story concerning Franz Liszt. In the mid-1840s, Liszt attended a private performance of Robert Schumann's piano quintet in E-flat. Splendid piece, by the way. And when asked for his opinion, Liszt said that the piece struck him as too Leipzigerisch, meaning that it struck him as being too much of the Leipzig style, too traditional in its musical forms, too conservative in its. So the understanding of Leipzig as a center of musical conservatism was understood not only by its adherents, but also by its opponents. Speaking of the opponents of musical conservatism, and speaking of Franz Liszt, let's turn our attention to this figure, because Liszt was one of the most important characters. Other side, the self-proclaimed progressive or modernist side. In the year 1848, Liszt settled in another German town called Weimar. Now, up until then, Liszt had spent about a decade touring the height and width and breadth of Europe as a piano virtuoso. Many of you have heard the stories about the Listomania that swept through many of Europe's capitals as this, the virtuoso to end all virtuoso made a stop in almost every important European city. By 1840, Liszt had become tired of the life of a traveling virtuoso. He decided that he wanted to settle down, devote more of his time and energy to conducting and composing. And so in 1848, he accepted an invitation from the Duke of Weimar to settle there and become the musical director, in effect, the director of the orchestra and of the musical life. This was a city with a truly illustrious past. After all, Weimar had been the city of Goethe, the city of Schiller. It had a really extraordinary intellectual and cultural background. Liszt was determined to make Weimar into a center for everything modern and progressive in contemporary music. And to that end, he became an energetic conductor and impresario. He presided over the premieres of many important works, including his own works, his so-called symphonic poems, more on those in a few minutes. He can of works by Berlioz, works by Wagner, including Wagner's opera Lohengrin. But I don't want to give the impression that Liszt was narrow in his musical outlook and sympathies. He also conducted important premieres of works by Schubert and Schumann and other important composers. And it was during the late 1840s and during the 1850s that Liszt created a series of works which he called symphonic poems. Symphonic poems. And a symphonic poem is really a synthesis of music with either poetry or the other art forms. If you look at Liszt's symphonic poems, and he composed about a dozen of them during this decade of the 1850s, they draw on a wide range of inspiration, including the poetry of Goethe, Schiller, Byron, Victor Hugo, also paintings. Some of them are inspired by philosophy, history, Greek culture. So they draw on a wide range of inspirations. But Liszt had a very important purpose here. Liszt believed that a new audience, a new musical audience, needed composers to reach out and try to combine music with description and storytelling. The 19th century was a period which saw a growing middle class, a growing market for sheet music, for concerts, for operas. And Liszt believed that in order for composers to draw in a larger audience, a larger proportion of this burgeoning middle class audience, they had to give listeners something concrete, music that either paints a picture or tells a story. Now, this isn't actually a radical idea. If you think about it, nowadays, when young children are introduced to music for the first time, it's very often in the form of something like Carnival of the Animals or Peter and the Wolf, stories where the instruments represent particular animals. And so the children can connect the melodies and the instruments with particular characters or a particular narrative. And that's really what Liszt was trying to do, but on a very broad and very massive scale. So Liszt was very much of the opinion that the old style of symphony, which came to be called as absolute music, a symphony which is just music for the sake of music, was old, outdated. For Liszt, programmatic music, descriptive music, was the wave of the future. Around the same time that Liszt was composing his symphonic poems, another German composer named Richard Wagner was writing various tracts, treatises on musical and artistic topics. Many of these date from the period right around the middle of the century, so 1849, 50, 51. And these include such writings as Art and Revolution, The Artwork of the Future, and Opera and Drama. A central aesthetic concept of Wagner's view of music is the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk. That's one of these wonderful German words. In English, it translates into total work of art. Gesamtkunstwerk. It means total work of art. And in Wagner's mind, this referred to union and cooperation of the distinct art forms, which for Wagner specifically meant poetry, music, dance. And more specifically, Wagner believed in the union and cooperation of these art forms in a supreme art form, namely the drama. And Wagner, of course, specifically meant his dramas, the Wagnerian music drama, as embodied in his works like Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, and later on, of course, The Ring of the Nibelung, which he was working on at the time. Like Liszt, Wagner believed that the old kind of symphony, the pure or absolute symphony, which with no admixture of text or story or narrative, was outmoded, old-fashioned, and Wagner believed that the future of music, indeed the salvation of music, lay in the cooperation and harmonious interaction of the various arts. And lest you think that this matter was purely an aesthetic one or purely related to artistic matters, Wagner believed that the current degenerate state of music and the other arts, poetry, dance, drama, was owing to their separation, and that this in turn led to the debased state of society as such. So Wagner wasn't just interested in aesthetics, he wasn't just interested in art. He believed that the current state of art was responsible for many of the ills of society and contemporary culture. And likewise, he believed that a regeneration of art through the music drama would bring about an improvement and a regeneration of society. This is a point worth pausing on because for the different composers that we're talking about here, there was much more at stake than purely musical issues or purely artistic issues. They actually believed that the fate of human culture and human society was closely bound up with these kinds of questions. And that points to a very important difference between the 19th century and our present age, namely that 150 years ago, 200 years ago, people actually took art seriously. They actually thought that art was of great existential importance. And that's something that we should consider and learn from. Now, a few final points. In the mid-1850s, there was a real movement in German music, which formed around the Liszt Wagner camp. And two very important phrases that emerged around this time were the phrase Zukunftsmusik. Zukunftsmusik means the music of the future. That's a phrase which I believe was originated by Wagner himself and taken up by the progressive musical journals of the day. Another term that was, so there was the future, and then another term that sprang up around the time was Neue Deutsches Schule, the new German school. And that was the actual term that was applied to certain composers like Berlioz, although Berlioz himself didn't see himself as part of any school or any movement, but because his music was perceived as progressive in many ways, he was sort of dragged into this debate against his will. But the primary composers who were seen as the figureheads of the new German school were Berlioz, Liszt, and of course Wagner. And of course, many commentators have since remarked on the fact that Wagner is really the only truly German composer of the three, Berlioz being a Frenchman and Liszt having been a Hungarian. But in the progressive press, the argument was made that, well, Berlioz and Liszt are actually German in spirit because they're progressive and they embrace this narrative of the need to take music into the future. One very important aspect for us to understand the music of the future and the new German school is the fact that this particular ideology was strongly conditioned by a Hegelian view of history. The philosopher Hegel had died in 1831, and the years following his death, many of Hegel's pupils from the University of Berlin had compiled his various lecture notes and published a book on philosophy of history. It was published in 1837 and it became hugely influential. It was read by everyone. Wagner read it, all the important intellectuals and artistic figures read Hegel's notes on the philosophy of history, and they were profoundly influenced by it. And Hegel describes history as a kind of a spirit or Geist moving towards the consciousness of freedom. What this specifically meant for aesthetics was this principle: art moves, art progresses, it evolves in the sort of Darwinian sense of evolution, that art evolves from a state of greater control and greater conservatism towards a state of greater freedom, greater progressivism, whatever you want to call it. And so the idea that was put forward by the adherents of the music of the future and the new German school was that Beethoven's music had been a kind of a thesis, if you want to put it in dialectical terms. It was a kind of an initial to which the music of Liszt and Wagner was an antithesis, a kind of a response. It was the second stage of the dialectical triad. And this would eventually give rise to the music of the future, a kind of a synthesis of the Beethovenian with the Lisztian and the Wagnerian, which would then lead to a sort of aesthetic or musical promised land, the third part of this dialectical triad. So, and this is a really good illustration of how ideas and art and music can interact. Now, the next phase of our story, we pick up in the fall of 1853. And in this part of the story, a shy young 20-year-old musician from Hamburg in the far north of Germany one day arrived in Dusseldorf and showed up on the doorstep of Robert and Clara Schumann, to whom he bashfully introduced himself. This shy, reticent young 20-year-old musician was named Johannes Brahms. And Brahms met Robert and Clara Schumann for the first time, played them some of his compositions, some of his early piano music, some of his early chamber music. Both Robert and Clara were deeply impressed by Brahms's work, by his integrity, by his artistic idealism. And shortly after this meeting, Robert Schumann wrote a very influential article. Now, side note, for quite a few decades prior to this, Schumann had been a very outspoken and vocal music critic. He was very, very active. He founded his own journal, wrote many articles. Schumann was actually the first critic to appreciate the genius of a young Polish pianist composer named Chopin. And he wrote many, many influential articles on Schubert, Mendelssohn, and other important composers. The last article that Schumann ever wrote, which was in the fall of 1853, was called Neue Bahnen. which means new paths. And in this, he held up this young, unknown Johannes Brahms as a kind of musical messiah who was destined to give expression to the voice of a new musical age. Understandably, a tremendous burden for a very shy and relatively unknown musician from the far north provinces of Germany. But nonetheless, this essentially established the battlegrounds between the Zukunftist, the new German school on the one hand, and which included Liszt and Wagner and their various adherents and supporters, and the more traditional school of Mendelssohn and Schumann, and of course now including the young Johannes Brahms. Where the War of the Romantics took a particularly ugly turn was in the late 50s or approaching 1860. And it was in 1860 that a manifesto was published in a Berlin newspaper strictly opposing the ideals and practices and works of the new German school. We believe now that the author of this manifesto was probably Brahms himself. And one of the embarrassing incidents was that this manifesto was leaked into the press. It was published in a very important Berlin journal with only 4 signatures, that of Brahms and 3 of his colleagues and friends. And this turned out to be, it was terribly embarrassing. The manifesto was lampooned in several other prominent publications. Obviously, Brahms and his supporters had intended to get more signatures, 20, 30, or whatever. But nonetheless, it was leaked into the press with only a handful of signatures. The essence of the manifesto was, we, the undersigned, strongly oppose the works and the ideology of the new German school, which we believe is contrary to the innermost spirit of music. And note particularly the wording there, contrary to the innermost spirit of music. So what exactly was this debate about? And we'll turn our attention to a few musical examples in a moment. Essentially, this debate was about principally 3 matters, but I'm going to talk about 2. The question of harmony and progressive tendencies in harmony, that's a little bit abstract for our present discussion. But the 2 aspects that I think we can deal with fairly easily are, first of all, questions of musical form. Should composers adhere to the traditional musical forms as laid down in the works of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, or should composers explore new musical forms? Liszt, of course, believed in the latter, and in promoting his symphonic poems, Liszt made the argument, we need new wine in new bottles, i.e. we need new expressive content and new expressive forms. That was part of Liszt's motivation for developing the symphonic poem. So that was one aspect of the debate. Another aspect of the debate is, should music be descriptive or not? And of course, Wagner said that music has to be redeemed through the drama, that drama is the only legitimate form of music. That was Wagner's argument. Liszt's argument is that music ideally should feature an integration of different art forms, that music should give expression to poetic ideas, pictorial ideas, philosophical ideas. And to this, the opponents of the new German school said no. And this is where the idea of absolute music or pure music comes in, music which is only about music. And so Brahms, when he began writing his chamber music, his piano sonatas, his string quartets, and eventually his symphonies, he completely repudiated this idea of music as a vehicle for description or painting or philosophy or anything like that. Before we turn our attention to some specific musical examples, let me pause for Irene, do we have any comments or super chats thus far?
Yes, we have 2 super chats, but no questions so far. There's just Jonathan Honig with $4.99 and Christopher Smith with $2 Canadian.99. Should I do the announcements now or later?
Yes, please.
Yeah. And so for tonight, in about half an hour, there'll be the Fountainhead Book Club. And then at 10 p.m. UK time, there is Artful Tuesdays.
Okay, thank you, Irene. And thank you to Jonathan and Christopher for your generous donations. We appreciate it very much. Let's turn our attention now to some actual musical examples. Let's begin with Wagner. I mentioned that in 1850, Franz Liszt had conducted the premiere of Wagner's opera Lohengrin. That was the last opera that Wagner completed before he went into his exile. Wagner had sort of an unsuccessful career as a political revolutionary. He'd gotten caught up in the revolutionary spirit of 1848, 1849 Europe. Specifically, he'd been a participant in the Dresden Uprising of May 1849, as a consequence of which a warrant was issued for his arrest, and Wagner was forbidden from setting foot on German soil for 11 years. Not until 1860s was he permitted to return to Germany. So Lohengrin was the last opera that he completed before his exile, and it was premiered in Weimar under Liszt's direction while Wagner was in exile in Zurich, Switzerland. Let's listen to just a little bit of the opening of the prelude, Act 1 of Lohengrin. So the opera Lohengrin begins with this prelude, which is the opera is actually, or one of the characters, the title character of the opera Lohengrin is a knight of the Holy Grail, who is sent out by the Grail to do heroic deeds, to protect the innocent, to punish the guilty. And the prelude to Act 1 is a musical depiction of the angels bringing the Holy Grail from heaven down to the earth, which Wagner symbolizes by taking the violins and dividing them into 4 parts. So we get this very delicate, shimmering music at the beginning of the Lohengrin prelude. At this point, I want to make 2 observations. It's significant that Wagner refers to this as a prelude to Act 1 and not an overture. Wagner's earlier operas, like Rienzi, The Flying Dutchman, and Tannhäuser, had featured overtures. And an overture is a piece which often makes use of themes from the opera itself and is generally structured along more traditional lines. You could almost say structured along more classical lines. But a prelude is something different. A prelude is a piece that doesn't necessarily have a traditional kind of structure. And this is something that the opponents of the New German School, the opponents of the music of the future, would have seen as a symptom of formlessness, of shapelessness. In fact, this prelude is not formless at all. We have the theme associated with the Grail, which is then taken up by different instruments. So we first hear it played by the violins, the high violins, then later on taken up by the woodwinds, then by the horns and the middle strings, and then finally by the brass at the climax of the piece. The piece does have a kind of a shape. It does have an organizing principle, but not a traditional or a conventional one. So that's one very important point. One other point I want to make is, even though Wagner here is writing an opera about the Grail, or about a knight of the Grail, Wagner was not a conventional Christian by any stretch of the imagination. This is a huge topic for another time. In fact, it's doubtful that Wagner was religious at all, but I'm just mentioning that to avoid any confusion. Wagner had something else in mind with his subject matter here, something we can discuss on another time. Let's listen to just another minute, and then I'll give you a sample of one of Liszt's symphonic poems. Here's just a little bit more of the Lohengrin prelude. And then at the point where I just stopped, that's where the wind instruments take up the Grail theme, which then later on gets passed. It goes Actually, musically, it descends. It begins the woodwinds, then the mid strings and the horns, and then eventually at the climax, the brass. And then in the last section of the prelude, as the angels bear the grail aloft back into the heavens, the music retraces its course, and the prelude actually begins as it ends as it began, with the very high, shimmering celestial violins. Turning our attention now to Liszt, arguably the most famous of Liszt's symphonic poems is called Les Préludes, which means the Preludes, inspired by a poem by Alphonse de Lamartine. This is a really excellent example of Liszt's procedure. And here again, Liszt does not make use of traditional symphonic poems, symphonic forms, conventional symphonic forms. Instead, he introduces an idea. It's this three-note idea, which is subjected to a series of permutations and transformations. And it's specifically the transformation of the theme which determines the musical form and the musical dramaturgy, if you want to call it that. So listen first of all for this three-note idea, this three-note theme. And then that three-note idea is taken up by the high woodwinds. And now in the next section of the piece, which is a build up to the first climax, the three-note idea is traded back and forth between the strings and the trombones. Trombones are a little difficult to hear at first, but when we finally reach the climax, the first climax of the piece, this three-note idea gives rise to a new extended melody, and there you'll be able to hear the trombones in all their glory. Trombones theme here is derived from that initial three-note idea, dee da da, but here dramatically extended and sped up compared to its earlier iterations. Two examples from each of the main protagonists of the New German School, or the Music of the Future School. Let's look at an example now from the other side, the opposing side. Namely, let's have a look at a passage from the First Symphony of Johannes Brahms. Now, this symphony was completed some years after the peak of this whole war. The peak years of the War of the Romantics was really the 1850s and a little bit into the 1860s. And this was primarily a Central European aesthetic war. So the composers in Italy, France, and Russia were involved only peripherally. They were certainly aware of it and were influenced by it, but mainly this was a Germanic, mainly a Central European phenomenon. That's one very important point. And the peak years were really the 1850s and early 1860s. But in many ways, Brahms's First Symphony, completed and premiered in 1876, is perhaps the most eloquent response to the whole music of the future, New German School idea. We're going to listen to a few passages from the finale, the fourth and final movement of Brahms's First Symphony. And let's begin with this the famous horn call near the beginning of the finale. Here it is. Provide a little bit of context here. Brahms waited until he was in his 40s before he completed and premiered his First Symphony. That's extraordinary when you consider that Mozart started writing symphonies when he was 8, and that Mendelssohn had started writing symphonies when he was in his early teens. For a composer to wait until he was in his 40s before beginning to release major symphonic works, that's quite remarkable. And it's a testament to the intimidating shadow cast by Beethoven, of which Brahms was very well aware. Brahms once remarked to a friend, "You have no idea how the likes of us feel when we hear the footsteps of a giant like him behind us." Brahms was aware of the challenge of writing a symphony after Beethoven, but he was also aware of writing a symphony in light of the criticisms made by people like Liszt and Wagner, who say, well, the purely instrumental symphony is a thing of the past. The future is in drama or program music. So Brahms's challenge was to write a purely instrumental symphony, but to be able to somehow justify it or prove its validity in light of everything that had gone before, in light of the Wagnerian music drama, the Lisztian symphonic poem. And the way Brahms did this is he wants to show that a purely instrumental symphony doesn't have to be impoverished, that it can embrace a wide range of experiences. And so that actually explains this particular horn call that Brahms introduces at this point. This horn call is an example of something called a Ranz de Vache, which is a Swiss cowherd call. And so it's a kind of a symbol of nature. It's a symbol of the great outdoors. And after being introduced by the horn, that very same melody is taken up by a flute. Brahms interjects or introduces a solemn figure played by the trombones. See what you make of this. Listeners of Brahms's time would immediately and instinctively have associated that trombone figure, that somber, solemn trombone figure, with a chorale. The chorale is the congregational hymn of the Lutheran Church. So it's an emblem of religion. It's an emblem of spirituality. What is Brahms trying to do here? What is he trying to say? Brahms is trying to say that a purely instrumental symphony doesn't have to be barren of content. It can embrace many aspects of human experience, but it can do it on its own terms without relying on words, texts, voices. Just the instruments by themselves can bring in nature, religion, spirituality. By the way, Brahms himself was, I think, leaning more towards the agnostic side. I don't think he was much of a devout religious worshiper, but nonetheless, he's trying to show different aspects of the human experience here and embodying them in purely musical terms. So we just had the trombone chorale, and now the horn call, the Swiss cowherd's call, returns, the emblem of nature. At this point in his symphony, Brahms does something really daring and controversial. Brahms was well aware that people would be comparing his symphony, his first symphony, with the symphonies of Beethoven, and more especially with the controversial Ninth Symphony by his great predecessor. And so far from shying away from the challenge, Brahms decided to meet it head on. So here Brahms introduces a new theme, this famous string theme, which directly and deliberately invokes the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. Can you hear the connection between that theme and the famous Freude or joy theme from the finale of Beethoven's Ninth? Just in case the connection is lost on the listener, Brahms makes it even more obvious, as I'll point out in a minute. So right at the point, if you think back to the Beethoven Symphony, Beethoven's Ninth, right at the point where the voices introduce the text, Deine Zauber bindet wieder, was die Mode strenge teilt. You know, that part of the Beethoven theme. Brahms takes a fragment of that and he actually repeats it 3 times for emphasis. I mean, that's virtually musical plagiarism right there, but it's plagiarism with a purpose. So what is Brahms trying to do here? He's, in a sense, Brahms is trying to correct a historical error. People had, in the wake of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, people had concluded that that's it. The instrumental symphony is done, and the future now belongs to program music or music drama. And Brahms is saying no. He's saying, well, so Beethoven had introduced voices in his finale. I don't have to do that. I can leave out the voices and leave out the text. Let the purely instrumental symphony reign on. And he's deliberately putting himself in competition with Beethoven here. I don't mean to suggest that Brahms is in some ways rejecting Beethoven's Ninth or criticizing it aesthetically. Rather, it's the perception that composers have to follow Beethoven's Ninth on Beethoven's own terms, as Liszt and Wagner had hinted earlier. That's specifically what Brahms is critiquing here. So before I get to my final thoughts, any final questions or super chats from anyone, Irene?
There's just Mary-Aline with $4 and then another $2, but no questions.
Okay, then thank you all very much for your generosity. To sum up here, I think in a way the new German school was a regrettable misunderstanding. Now, I don't really take sides in the debate. I can see some of the merits of both of the arguments. On the one hand, I certainly agree with Liszt that if one wants to appeal to a larger audience, a new middle-class audience, writing music inspired by poetry, inspired by literature can be very, very effective. I don't think that's necessarily the only way. In fact, I disagree with, in principle, with any idea that music has to be such and such. Music has to be drama. Music has to be programmatic. I also disagree with the notion that music can't be programmatic or descriptive. But we have a different perspective now. Looking back 150 years later, we can appreciate and value the works of all of these composers. The composers of the Mendelssohn, Schumann, Brahms camp on the one hand, the composers of the Berlioz, Liszt, Wagner camp. We can take it all in and enjoy it and appreciate it without being wrapped up with the various ideological struggles that these composers themselves were embroiled in. So I think the debate, the acrimonious debates were a little bit of a waste of energy, a little bit of a waste of time. But at the same time, I recognize the broader context here that these were individuals who took music seriously, who regarded music as being, and art more generally, as being of life and death importance. And I think that's something that we can take away from the War of the Romantics, a commitment to aesthetic ideals without necessarily being dogmatic or necessarily taking sides in a debate such as this one, but embracing the idea that art is important and that art is closely connected with human culture and human society. With that, I thank you all very much for joining me with this discussion, and I look forward to chatting with you again very soon. Thank you all very much.